Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another Tea with Tink. This actually is being brought to you as a pre-record. I'm incredibly excited by the guest that we have today, as she's coming to us all the way from Canberra to talk about a particularly topical topic at the moment. I'm sorry it's not live today. There's so much going on now as we wait for the Prime Minister to call an election date, that I confess it's getting harder and harder to be able to do Tea with Tink real time. But it's part of my commitment to our community. It's really important we continue to have these conversations and learn the stuff that can help us make better policy decisions going forward. So joining me today, I'm very excited to say I have the amazing Dr. Caroline Venga. So Caroline has a really interesting backstory in terms of the things she's studied and the places that she's worked. She's worked for the National Water Commission along the way, has always been an active member of local land care groups, and she's also worked with WWF. The reason we're chatting to her today is that actually about 5 years ago, Caroline did a thesis on flood management, and particularly as it relates to climate change. And given our recent circumstances here in Australia, we thought it was very fortuitous when we found Caroline and thought it was a great time for us to chat to her about what her observations were when she did her thesis, and then to really potentially nail down into where we are today and what some of the things are that we need to be mindful of going forward. So Caroline, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I really appreciate it. Can we start? Can you just help everybody understand a little bit about your thesis topic and how you actually found yourself getting to that point in your life where you were doing that work?
Well, it was a bit unpredictable, really. I'd worked for WWF for quite a few years for Jamie Pittock, who was the director of Global Fresh Water, and he eventually moved to the ANU and started work on flood management. And he also studied the Murray-Darling Basin and water issues there. And a little while later, I got this phone call from him saying, "Oh, could you come and do some research for me?" And so I found myself sort of plunged in at the deep end, doing research into a topic I'd never really sort of looked at before, which was flood management. So I did
Mhm.
that for a year. It was just a short-term contract. And then he said, you could turn this into a thesis if you want. Just have to do a little bit more work. Well, a little bit more work was perhaps an understatement.
I was going to say, said
Yeah,
like a true mentor and academic.
yes, absolutely. I didn't quite know what I was in for, but yeah, I carried on and persisted. And yes, so I studied the impact of climate change on flood management. And most of what I did was comparative studies. What are we doing here in Australia? What are they doing overseas? What sort of innovative approaches are they using? And could we actually transfer some of those approaches here to Australia? Because
Mhm.
we didn't seem to be, very adaptive for the long term here in Australia for climate change.
Mm. And that, I mean, that phrase that you've just used then, that adapted for the long term, I mean,
Mm.
that really has been something that has been coming up more and more, particularly recently, given that we've had the floods on, the north coast of New South Wales. If we kind of stay in the space of your research, were there any what were the key observations of your research as you looked into it, key findings?
Well, I suppose the key findings, one of them would be that in Australia, we're very focused on structural approaches. And by structures, I mean physical things like dams and levees. And whereas overseas, they're sort of looking at other types of approaches where you actually break down the levees, you decommission them, you give more space for the floods so that there's actually more room for them to flood. You do a lot of relocation of development um, to higher ground or in some places, they're also looking at innovative building design. So in some places, actually, um, houses that float and go up and down. Of course,
Wow.
well, this is, you've got to make sure it's in an area that's suitable where it lifts slowly and gradually. Not you don't really want high currents for that sort of thing, and so house raising. But I mean, some of these approaches are perhaps not so useful for, say, elderly people that will need to climb upstairs and so on. So you have to be a bit careful about some of these measures,
Hmm.
but they do have their place.
Mm.
The only problem I found with my research was that we have a lot of different institutions and politics, which sort of means that it's harder to transfer some of these approaches. So, like, just for one example, in America, they use relocation a lot more than they do here. But in America, the there's a federal agency that provides national flood insurance, and so they are liable when private houses flood.
Right.
After a private house floods like 7 times, and they add all of that up, they think, well, it makes more financial sense instead of repeat flooding, and we've got to, the cost of the rebuilding of the house
Mm.
multiplied by 7 makes more financial sense for us to move that house or
Mm.
that town. Whereas here in Australia, it's not really so easy because private houses are a private responsibility, not the government responsibility. So if a person, a private person has to foot the expense rather than the government, then the government isn't really going to put so much financial effort into relocating the development.
Mm.
So I did find that although it sounds great, some of these approaches are not so easily transferable. Yeah,
Well, it sounds like something like that would take long-term planning too. Yeah, like if we were to take
absolutely.
that approach, that's an approach that we'd need to, I assume, transition to over time. We couldn't just suddenly turn it on tomorrow.
You're quite right. Short termism is a real problem.
Right.
Short term political uh, yeah, political timeframes and so on, and also who benefits. You've really got to look at who benefits,
Mm.
and there's lots of policy conflict. So there's a lot of talk in the news at the moment about um, things like unaffordable housing. Well, where do you put cheap housing? In flood-prone land because it's cheap land. So
Right.
there's a bit of a policy conflict there as well.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that there are all sorts of things which you don't necessarily think about,
Mm.
but you really have got to when you're thinking about building back better. I think the most important thing is you've got to pre-plan it, because
Mm.
when are people most willing to relocate? It's right after a flood.
Mm.
You wait for 5 more years afterwards to sort of put all the processes in place, then it's not going to happen.
Mm.
As people forget, and there's less impetus. But if you front load it, then it's more likely to happen.
Mm. So, I mean, given what we've recently experienced here in New South Wales with the floods, and I should not just New South Wales, but up in Queensland as well, were you surprised by what you saw taking place at the beginning of this year, or do you think we should have reasonably been expecting to see this sort of flood effect here in Australia?
Definitely expecting it.
Mm.
And flood studies have been done in those areas. Everyone knows that it's a flood risk area.
Right.
But like places like Lismore, they knew that it's actually quite a dangerous, hazardous area. And actually, they have had some very innovative policies in Lismore in the past. Like I actually looked this up before I came.
Oh, fantastic.
Um, there's this. Oh, I can't even find it. But yeah, that there's here we are. Lismore. on the New South Wales coast provides an exceptional example of house raising. Over 95% of the dwellings located in a 1 in 100-year floodline have been modified in this way. So that was from some years ago. It's a textbook by this guy called Dinglesmith, David Inglesmith, who's quite well known, though he's retired now. But I've actually got a friend who lives fairly nearby in Kyogle, and she works in Lismore. And I just told her about this, about how there are all, it's the one spot in Australia where they've really taken house raising seriously. How wonderful! And she said, yes, well, I remember when I was a kid, there were a lot of raised houses, but now they've all infilled underneath.
Ah,
People forget. And
yeah.
that's one of the problems. When you live in a flood-prone area, and a flood only comes intermittently every 5 or 10 years or so, you forget.
Mm,
And when you put a levee up, then that gives you the illusion of protection, and you forget even more because
mm,
the flood comes even less frequently, so you lose that experience.
mm. It's interesting, actually, isn't it? Because I think I want to just back up too, because the piece that you just read from that textbook talked about houses being raised to a level that would enable them to cope with the 1 in the 100-year flood. But I mean, arguably, we've now had two once in a 100-year floods in the last 2 months.
Mm.
Yeah, it's so. Should we, if and should we, from a scientific point of view, should we be expecting to see these floods happening more frequently? Is it realistic to expect they'll only be once in 100 years going forward?
Well, I suppose there are a few things you should think about here. First of all, Australia's flood record, we've only been settled for or had records in some areas, flood
Mm.
records for like 80 years. So,
Yeah,
we're extrapolating.
right.
There's another thing is that climate change, a 1 in 100-year flood will become more frequent. So I've read statistics where it'll say a 1 in 100-year flood will happen more like a 1 in 10 years by the
Right.
end of this century. So, and another thing is it's an average thing. So you can get a 1 in 100-year flood one year, and then a 1 in 100-year flood the next, in 5 years, and then nothing for another 500 years, or, statistically, it should be 1 in 100 years, but, you could get one after the other.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I feel, just as a consumer, I mean, I grew up out in northwest New South Wales in a town called Coonabarabran, and my parents live on a small property, and through the middle of which runs a river called the Castle Ray.
Mm.
Um, but it was always, I just knew as a kid growing up, even on my grandparents were on properties in Narrabri and Binaway, you just didn't build where you anticipated the water was going to rise too far. And so as a consequence, you might end up in situations where the water would come right up to that back veranda, but it would never quite tip over because you always made sure you were out of that flood prone zone. I want to come back to something you said a little bit earlier about the fact that, we seem to have decided to bend those rules in terms of our public planning processes because flood prone areas are cheaper to build on. I mean, to me, that almost sounds counterintuitive because it
It
may
is.
be cheaper in the short term, but surely it's got to be more expensive in the longer term.
Well, you have to look again at who this benefits. So the council might get more rates from it, the developer makes a packet, but the responsibility for the risk doesn't lie with them. The responsibility lies with the private owner and with insurance companies.
Right.
And when you build a levee as well, and you say that that area is now protected, so you sort of excise that area which is technically in the floodplain, you excise it from the floodplain, you say, well, this is now protected.
Mm.
And actually, it's not really, it's just a temporary protection. um, to a certain level. But that land that's so-called protected suddenly increases in value, and that encourages more buildings to be built there. But as far as the planners are concerned, and this is the case for Wivenhoe Dam and things as well, that they'll say, oh well, this area used to be susceptible to flood, but now because of the Wivenhoe Dam, therefore we can say that this is no longer flood prone and we can build there.
Right.
Whereas in fact, if it overtops, then you will get worse damages, more expensive damages than you would have done if the dam hadn't been there, if the levee hadn't been there, because that development wouldn't have been there.
Mm. I want to kind of just, I'm not sure if you actually have had a chance to look at this, or I'd just actually be interested in your opinion. This past week, we saw the current federal government brought down a budget, and there was a significant amount of money in that. In fact, in the quantum of billions of dollars for regional developments, a number of which were dams to be built around different locations. And what really struck me is that I went on to read, I think it was the day after the budget came down, or maybe the following day, that very few of the dams that had actually been identified as being built under this federal budget have actually got a business case or have been fully explored as being good ideas, for our nation. Given what you saw, I mean, you've touched on the fact that, it's problematic here in Australia because there's a lot of politics involved in water management and a number of institutions that sort of have insight into it. If you were Prime Minister for a day and you had the power to do what you felt you needed to do, are there, two or three things that you would prioritise changing in Australia to make us able to be more flood resilient and flood adaptive, if they're appropriate words?
Definitely, I think ecosystem-based approaches are probably the best way that you could do it. So you don't develop the floodplains and either side rivers. That's prime habitat, and water. If you protect those rivers, then you protect water quality. You enable wildlife to have this natural corridor,
Mm-hmm.
great for recreation and health and tourism. So, and you just put a little bit of development there, which is flood resilient, or if it does get washed away, then it doesn't cost so much to replace, kiosks and things like that, and a few jetties and bike tracks and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you have flood resilient development. And another thing you can also do is there's a difference between flooding in the tops of the catchments and lower down. So if you can hold the water in the landscape for longer, because what we usually do is we try and whoosh the water downstream as quickly as possible and get it out of here. Whereas what we should actually be doing is try and trap that water so that it's because water is such a valuable commodity here in
Mm.
Australia with our droughts. So we should be thinking drought plus flood. When we are lucky enough to have those floods, the tops of the catchments are usually where there's the least expensive development, because all of our development is down in the by the coast and
Mm-hmm.
sort of further down. So hold that water, uh, replenish our groundwater tables, let it out very slowly, and then you won't get this high velocity flood water.
Mm.
Allow it to seep slowly down and hydrate our landscapes. And there are some areas like Maloon Creek, which is just east of Canberra, where
Mm-hmm.
they've actually done that, but they've done it for agriculture.
Right.
And they've rehydrated their landscape, which was really degraded. So they've got about 60% increased productivity, and the water quality below the farm is potable, whereas it wasn't now. It runs all the time instead of drying out. So it's really benefited downstream as well as upstream. So
Hmm.
I'd say ecosystem-based approaches are probably the best way you could go. And
Mm.
yeah.
And it sounds like, I mean, have this concept in my head that when it comes to federal government, what is the role of federal government? And I think there's been lots of discussion about this recently. But to me, it's fundamentally three things. I think our federal government should be a place that we look to for leadership in terms of setting, an agenda and a strategy across our country, um, with the intention and with the ability to actually draw on the best minds across our country to say what would we do, if we were actually planning out for the next decade or the next 2 decades rather than the next 3 years. So leadership. Then their second role, I think, is coordination, so that actually you get over those borders that are state borders or territory borders or, geographical borders. Our federal government is, our highest governing body in the land. If it's not coordinating across states and territories, then nobody is, because that's really where it should be happening. And then the third thing would be stimulus where it's required. So sending really strong signals to the market, both domestically and internationally, that this is where our future lays. So this is what we're going to invest in, And so I think in listening to you today, I feel like it seems there is an opportunity for our federal government to be doing those three things as it relates to water management and flood management and preparedness across our country. It's lead, get in the helicopter and look from the big picture down, remove all the on the ground politics. So it is looking at it as a one ecosystem, then coordinate across the ecosystem to get consensus and to build that collaborative approach. And then where necessary, provide some economic stimulus to get the right outcome in place. Does that sound reasonable to you?
I think there is definitely a role for the federal government in encouraging this sort of approach and looking at what the obstacles are. Though I have to say, with flood management, natural resources, it's generally a state
Yeah.
responsibility, state government responsibility. So you have got to be very careful about what the roles are for different governments.
Mm,
But certainly, I could see that the federal government could do an awful lot to encourage this approach
mm,
and incentivize it. Mm.
mm. Fantastic. And so you're still Prime Minister for a day. Is there anything else that you would do?
Ah, I think a federal integrity commission would be very good.
You are talking my language, Caroline. You're talking my language. It's fantastic. Um, Caroline, thank you so much for chatting with me today and for sharing everything that you've learnt and seen. I know, I feel your frustration in terms of the things that you believe we do know, and therefore we could be accommodating. But at the moment, those differing political requirements are pulling us in different directions. So I think, often actually in this particular format in Tea for Tink, we've heard that, that it really is a case of, it's not that we don't know what we need to do, it's just that we don't have the political will to do it. We're not bringing the right weight behind. So it strikes me again that this is another case where we actually do know what we need to be doing. It's just that there's nobody who's had the political will to fight for that, to see it done, because it's a longer term problem rather than just a one term government issue. Fantastic. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank
Um,
you for the opportunity.
It's been great talking to you. So, thanks for joining in today, tuning in today. As always, please, if you've got any questions, feel free to share them with us, and we will get them through to Caroline. I'm sure Caroline, if she's able to answer, will help us answer. And if it's something that we can dig into as a campaign here in the federal seat of North Sydney, we will definitely do that. What I've really heard from Caroline today is another really good example of the fact that we do have knowledge in this country about how to tackle some of these things, that it's irresponsible of us to continue to pretend like we're not going to see frequent flooding events on our continent and in our country in the next decade to 2 decades. So really, this is an opportunity for us to think further than just a one-term government and to make some long-term planning decisions so that we have systems and processes in place that mean we're adapting and mitigating from tomorrow, rather than having to leave people in situations where they're continually put under extreme distress by experiencing flood events. So again, thank you so much, Caroline, and to everybody else. I will see you soon. So thanks again for tuning in, and North Sydney, let's change the climate in Canberra. See you.
Authorised by Kylea Tink, North Sydney, New South Wales.